Hello, thanks for joining us again on China Manufacturing Decoded, the podcast from Sofeast. Good to have everybody here, and Renaud is back with me. Adrian, hi Renaud.
Hi Adrian, and hi everybody.
Just so you know, if you're keeping track of these things, this is episode 151. Now, last week, Renaud, Andrew was on with me and we were talking about testing for packages, ISTA testing. So that's making sure that the package is actually going to withstand the punishment it's going to get during transit and everything's not going to be broken. But this week, something completely different. So we're going down the quality route, and the topic that we're going to be covering is what happens if you have repeated quality issues with your factory, who you're, outsourcing your manufacturing to in Asia, more than likely, right? And you've got 6 tips and, well, a bit of other information about this topic as well, right?
Yeah. So we regularly get contacted by people who say, well, we work with this supplier, but it's from bad to worse, and we have this and this sort of issues with them, and let's just focus on quality issues in this episode. And it's always sort of the same stories. Most of the time it's there's a few usual suspects, and you ask a few questions and then you're like, okay, yeah, I see, it fits that pattern, right? So that's what we want to cover. And really, first, a few tips, 6 tips for making sure that they actually understand your quality standard, that they're aware of it and that they are more likely to comply with it. Because this is really the basics, is the fundamentals, right? If they don't even know what you require, that's a very big problem, isn't it? How do you expect them to match, to reach your requirements? That's a problem. So first thing is, as a buyer, you have to, to sweep in front of your door. You need to make sure that you yourself are doing your part of the job. Okay. And probably when people say, well, this supplier has repeated quality issues and so on, most of the time, of course, I'm not saying the supplier is not at fault and maybe they overpromised on a lot of things and so on, but really, most of the time it already means that the buyer maybe did not do the proper due diligence, did not have the factory audited, did not make sure, double confirm the supplier's understanding about, what customers require, and did not ask the right questions, and so on and so forth. That's one thing. Okay, but that's sort of behind the buyer. That's the past. And of course, one of my tips is going to be to switch to a new supplier. But very first thing is, hey, what about your quality standard? Right? You get to first tell the supplier what is wrong. Okay, they do something wrong, you're not very happy about it, you gotta get back to them, provide them some feedback. Okay, and if it's feedback from your own customers and you're just passing it on lazily to your own supplier, it's probably not going to be in the right format to be effective. Okay.
Right.
If supplier gets, one box and you open the box and the first 2 products are bad, you're going to tell that to your supplier and they're going to say, well, it's still, you just open 1 box out of 200 boxes and you just check the first 2 pieces. What does that mean about the entire batch? It doesn't mean anything, right? This customer was unhappy, and then you don't tell us about the other customers who are happy. So it doesn't really have an impact, right? The way to tell the supplier about the quality issues is important. You need to do a little bit of homework here also. You need to actually go and have a little bit of a structured approach. We open 10 boxes, this is blah, 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 right? And if it's an issue on 100% of the products, then tell them, I picked 20 products from 10 different boxes. and they all display this kind of problem. And here's photos, here's how to measure it or test it or confirm it visually, and this is not acceptable because this is what we told you, and ideally it's because look at the approved sample and you, Mr. Supplier, have the same approved sample in your factory. Side-by-side comparison is visibly different, or I measure it this way and it's pretty clearly different, right? Or I don't know, I operate this electrical product, and when I do this, it doesn't do that. But the sample does it that way, and that's what we approved of, right? That's often buyers will have an approved sample, and in that case, that can be useful. Sometimes they don't even have an approved sample, or they don't have the same, they did not get several samples, check that they're all the same and all okay, and send it one back to the factory, blah, 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 right? They don't do this. So even the supplier might not really understand because they might not have kept the same sample that was prepared at the same time as the one they sent to you, right? So that's a problem. If you have already communicated to them, this is very important, it needs to be this way and that way, and it's written black on white, okay, great. Find that discussion, show it to them. Very often it's in email, sometimes in WeChat or Skype or something like that, which is pretty bad, frankly, because it can be wiped out and disappears. If you change from one computer to another or something like that, it could just disappear, among other reasons. So try to find that, take a screenshot and say, that day I showed you this and I told you that, and now here's what I found, and it's different, right? But you need to show them that this is not the standard that you approved, okay, if possible, or this is not compliant to the instructions you gave them, because in China there's a saying is that if it's not written, it doesn't exist. If you told them, then they're gonna be like, oh, I don't know. Yeah, we forgot it. Yeah, you mentioned a lot of things, in that meeting and 6 months ago. How am I supposed to remember every little detail? And maybe they would even say, well, I don't think you say that. Actually, I think you say this was okay. And then, but memory is not very reliable. How do you come back to this kind of comment, right? So the way to tell them is very important, okay? And provide photos, videos, provide a clear way of comparing or testing or measuring, with a clear standard and, maybe a clear specification and tolerances and things like that. So at least they know it going forward, right? Okay. The second tip is don't wait. The later you tell them, the worse it is for you. Okay. Yeah. If you tell them when they're putting together some pre-production prototypes or samples, well, okay, then go ahead and do the new round of samples and fix it and done. Good. You lost a little bit of time, and that's it. If they start to put together a mass production for you, and maybe you work with a company like ours, we send an inspector, we find the issues. Well, the products are still at the factory. And if it's during production, they can already, hopefully, either like stop production or make some changes right away so that the rest of production is does not display the same issues, hopefully in the best cases that's possible, right? If you wait until everything is finished and then you have an inspector go there and find the problem, well, already it's harder to get to a quick and easy resolution because they really don't want to reopen all the boxes and put everything back on the line and make some changes, and that maybe they need to reorder some components and tear apart the product and so on and so forth. Obviously, it's very painful for them, and they might already start to say things like, you never told us about that. We didn't know it was a problem. You want to change now? uh, we cannot do these changes on this order. Sorry, we'll be on the next time, but you cannot tell us now, and maybe you've already paid 100%. So what can you do, right? And again, if you haven't specifically written it to them and gotten their clear okay, or if you don't find that, it doesn't exist. That's China, unfortunately. All right. So give feedback early on as much as you can.
Makes sense.
Okay. Yeah. Tip number 3 is something I saw in many cases is, let's say that there's a final quality inspection at the end of production, and the inspectors find some problems, and then the buyer, is like, "Oh, I'm really not comfortable with that." However, maybe there's a tight deadline, and the buyer is thinking, let's say the importer is thinking, well, if I let them ship this week, then my own customers are going to get it on time, and at least I'm not going to get killed with that. And this might be a quality issue, might not be a huge issue. I'm not really sure, right? So the temptation is just to say to the supplier, okay, go ahead and ship. And then you can say, I'm not happy, blah, 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 blah. But you tell them, okay, and ship. What's going to happen is they're going to remember it, right? And maybe you get down on the salesperson, and you're really upset, and you're all red in the face and so on, and you think, well, they really remember. They don't want to have that kind of humiliation again or something. But if it's a problem from maybe one of their suppliers, the purchasing people don't know, and they don't tell the supplier maybe, or whatever, right? There's no real feedback. It doesn't go all the way to the source of the problem. Or maybe it's in their production, and the salesperson is the salesperson. Maybe she's not even in the same facility, maybe not even the same city as the factory. I mean, and the people in production are like, it's fine. They did an inspection, they took it, so it's not a problem.
Yep.
Right?
You've just set a new quality standard.
Yes, exactly. It becomes a precedent, right? And then you just shot yourself in the foot. You just diluted your own standard. So be very careful. Now, what can you do? I would say there's no good solution. Maybe some buyers, just to prevent that, from being a precedent, ask the supplier to sign a letter of whatever, letter of guarantee that it would never happen again, and they understand that it's only accepted once and blah, blah, blah. Sometimes they negotiate a discount on the next order. Now that's, sort of slapping on the wrist of a kid, it's a bit, how to say, is not a great approach. And the thing is, you might negotiate a discount for the next order. Well, next order, you're going to try to find a way to avoid, losing money, at least make a little bit of money. So they might actually get more of an incentive to cheapen your product. So sometimes they can come back and bite you in the behind. This is something that needs to be treated very, very carefully, right? So, as I mentioned, if you define your standard, okay, I want this, I don't want that, and so on, in different WeChat, messages and a few emails and some calls and so on, doesn't get properly documented, that's not good. Okay, so you need to get it on paper, black on white, in one master document per product or per product category. Okay, and there's something relatively easy, is that if you had some samples and you had a batch of product already, or 2, 3, 4 batches of product, and you had some quality issues, because usually that's how this conversation sort of starts. Well, then collect these photos, take the photos of the problems, as I mentioned, send it as feedback to the supplier, but keep them. definitely keep them in a folder. And then when you have time, open, and it could be whatever. It could be a PowerPoint presentation, a Word document, a Google Doc that you will save, export as PDF. Whatever is better than nothing here. But organize these photos and organize them maybe by, I don't know, area of the product or type of defect, something like that. Try to find your own logic through that. And maybe there's some defects on the export packing and the inner packing and the labeling and the product aesthetics and the product maybe function and things of that nature. And you put these photos in the document and you write. Ideally, you write it in the way that will be useful to a quality inspector who works for you. So think of it as training for an inspector. And an inspector needs to know what is a defect or not a defect. That's the first thing. Okay, so you might see some imperfections, and you might want to say, okay, take a photo of the imperfection, I describe it a little bit, and then I say, if it is maybe at the bottom of the product, okay, people are really usually not going to see it. So if it's not bigger than that, it's okay, it's acceptable, it's an imperfection, but it's not to be called a defect. So already you have an indication of what is not a defect. Okay, and then what is a defect? An inspector is going to want to know what is critical, major, minor. This is so there's nothing set in stone or magical about this category. It's not even in the statistical standards that provide the AQL limits and so on. But it's very, very widespread, and it's not a bad way of categorizing the kinds of defects, right? So critical is something you don't want. Even one issue, one critical defect in a whole shipment, is something that would cause rejection. So if it's something maybe that the customs might see on a pallet or on a carton, and it might lead to a lot of trouble, or maybe something that might hurt the user, harms personal safety or something like that. Anything non-compliant to the rules and regulations, boom, critical. But don't abuse it. Don't go beyond what I mentioned. And then what is a major defect? So a major defect is basically if you sell to consumers, let's say the products are in stores. Imagine a consumer would go and see the product, and then a relatively discerning customer will kind of, they would look at the product before they pick it, right? But if it's not a trained inspector, but a customer who looks at the product and want the product to look nice and so on and to function, and they would play a little bit with it, and then if they see the defect, they would consider it as a problem. They would not buy the product, right? And maybe they bring it home, they see that defect, they will be unhappy to the point where they will bring it back to the store. Okay, this is sort of the easy way of categorizing it. Now, if e-commerce is something that will cause them to return the product, for example, okay, you need to adjust it. If it's B2B, or it's maybe a product doesn't function, or you need to translate it into the logic of the end customers and users. All right, and then minor defects. It's something that they might or might not notice, and if they notice it, usually on average, the customer will not return the product, but they will not be thrilled. They will not be so happy. So you also want to have a limit on that, and on the proportion of minor defects. Also, you don't want 30% or half of your products to have a minor defect. Okay, so based on this logic, you organize the photos, and then for every one of them you write critical, major, or minor, or something like that. Or not a defect, if whatever, if it's not very visible, if it's, light color on light color, or dark color on dark color, or if it's at the back of the product, or right? You need to adjust this on to your product. Okay, so this is super helpful for the inspectors at the factory. Super helpful for the inspectors who will work for you and check the production. Super helpful for you later to come back to the customer and say, hey, 10% of your products that are received are major defective. That means something. Okay, and this can be used also as an appendix to a manufacturing agreement or something like that, right? When you do a whatever you call it, sales or purchase agreement or whatever, a commercial agreement, but that it's a very good practice to do it and to mention that document and keep it as an appendix, because it will typically keep evolving over time. And every time, of course, you send it to supplier, make sure they get it, they understand, they confirm it's okay with them, right? And then if they go back on it, then you can say, well, hey, here, I got you. You confirmed it, right? Maybe have someone with their name, to write on it and sign on it and so on. And it's always better if you work with a Chinese supplier to have actually the defect classification and description to be translated. And maybe you can find someone on your side to do that, and it will ensure that it's not messed up by a salesperson, right? Who will do a translation job, might botch the translation job, and might not even pass it on to production and to their quality team. I mean, sometimes we see some amazing things, right? It just gets lost somewhere in a mailbox. So that's not good. That was tip number 4, right?
Yeah.
Tip number 5, now that you have documented that and you have classified, these are some of the critical, major, and minor defects based on past issues. Well, you can actually provide a tolerance on that. Okay, and this is a podcast, so we cannot really do a screencast and say, okay, look at how the tables work and this and that. But to simplify it, on average, if you keep buying the same kind of product from the same manufacturing place in a series of batches, and you can say, well, and trusting the supplier and sort of taking most of the risk of not catching issues and not putting too much risk of actually catching issues while they are actually not that big of an issue, right, on the manufacturer. So that's the logic behind the what a lot of people call the AQL inspection system, for random inspections. So I guess some listeners are already thinking, well, what is it going into? I'm dropping out of here. There's I think we'll include simply a link in the show notes, so you can go and read about that and see what the sort of a generally accepted level of limits, AQL limits that tend to apply to products of average, lower than average level of quality, let's say it this way, maybe in Western Europe and North America. Okay, and when I say average, it's definitely not upper average, right? It's average and lower average.
Yeah.
And then the thing is, a lot of suppliers are used to it if they've been exporting for some time. I mean, they will not discover that. They've heard of it. They kind of understand how it works, sort of. And then if you give them different limits, they will be like, no, hey, this is what we do, blah blah blah, and if you try to go for tighter limits, they might say, well, then we have to do more inspection work and we have to scrap more of the material, blah blah blah. There's a lot of waste, the cost goes up 20%. So obviously, the earlier you cover that, the better, right?
Yeah.
But it's better to do it now than never. Okay.
Right, and you need to weigh up.
Yeah.
You need to weigh up which AQL limits are going to be right for you.
Yeah. Yes. The sort of generally accepted ones, generally used ones may not be the best fit for your company. You have to think about it. You have to really understand the impact of poor quality on your company, even if it's in low proportions. If having 2, 3, 4, 5% of bad products, if it might hurt you pretty bad, then you need to go with tighter limits, right?
Yep.
And if really proportion 1, 2% of defects going to hurt you, that might push you to reconsider your entire setup, right? And just doing random inspections at the end of production is not going to cut it. Is not going to be sufficient. It's going to be good to catch sort of widespread issues, right? With relatively high certainty that it's going to catch it, but it's not going to be good to avoid even 1% of defectives. No, it's not going to be sufficient. So, tip number 6 is if it doesn't really work, if the manufacturer is not receptive, if they're not taking action, if things don't improve, or you see clearly that there's no indication that things will improve, well, guess what? It's not going to improve. You have to assume that, unfortunately. And at one point, you need to switch to another supplier, right? So that's where it becomes very complicated for some buyers, because a lot of companies that buy products, that's especially true in China, are just setting up marketing channels for products that are sort of on the shelf, available for distribution. And then they go to whatever, Guangzhou, and they find a lot of things, a lot of samples, and they say, okay, just this one, I want it in gray with this logo, and this is the packaging, and I want 5,000 of it. Well, you cannot just switch to another supplier. First, it's not your product. So you need to think of, either going back to look for a similar product that another supplier has, or redevelop it from scratch. But if you're in this situation, it's a very weak situation, especially if there's maybe a plastic injection molding enclosure and things like that. And there's investment at stake. You're not going to be able to just go ahead and magically switch it to another supplier. Okay, there's going to have to be investments and preparation and so on. But if you're just distributing a product, a lot of companies have to deal with that. Distribute a product that's not really their product, and they just have to live with, bad quality from their supplier. Now they can mitigate it by, putting some extra pressure on this and that, and sort of, trying to block the shipments before they leave the factory if they're bad, and so on, and keep applying some pressure and saying, here it hurts me because of, I don't know, my bad reviews on Amazon or this or that, and we could double the sales if quality is consistently good and so on. So you sort of show them the carrot, but in many cases, within what you would call the short and mid-term, in many cases, nothing works. Okay, nothing has an impact. Because in a lot of cases, it's poor design. It's not even a poor manufacturing. You picked a product that's already designed, but it's not really a product. It was designed in a horrible way. And, you have overrated components that maybe, heat up and burn. You have components that are, maybe mechanical components that's too weak and ruptures too easily, or something of poor reliability just ends up breaking after a certain number of cycles, or whatever, right? It could be a lot of things. It could be a lot of things. So that's the situation. if you're distributing a product that's not your product, you're in a weak situation. If it's your product and you've developed it, and you can switch more easily to a new manufacturer if you have the BOM and if you have the design files and everything. That's something we discussed many times on this podcast.
Yeah.
Is you then in that case you have it easier to switch to another supplier, right? In that case, basically developing and ramping up a backup factory and over time replacing the original bad manufacturer, right? Now, if the original bad manufacturer gets their act together, then, hey, you have a backup, you have two factories to make a product, and maybe the backup is not that good in the end, right? So that's not necessarily a bad thing, let's say it this way. So that's about the case where you find that the factory is not following your standard, and you need to make sure that they're aware of it and they will be more likely to comply with it. But in a lot of cases, maybe you pick the wrong supplier, or maybe the supplier is for whatever reason, is not a good fit for you, or is just unable to produce consistent quality. So even if you explain to them, this is my standard, this is what I want, and say you're blue in the face, still it doesn't make a difference, right? And there's something I wanted to cover here, because people very often don't try to understand what happened, why is it inconsistent, why do I getting the price every time, why how come they give so little attention to my orders, or or it's like, how come I'm so unlucky? No, this is not luck. All right, this is not luck. Basically, one possibility, and I just mentioned it, is design issues. The wrong components were selected, or the wrong whatever. It's put together the wrong way. It's not just not designed for that kind of use, and so on and so forth. Okay. Then you get an R&D team to do a design review and so on, and maybe you need to work on redesigning it. Okay. But the types of issues that you find, and also when you find issues, will tell you if it's a design issue. Okay. If it's a manufacturing issue, usually it's dead right out of the box if it's an electrical product, or it's caught during production, or just after production, right away, right? Or it appears within 1, 2, 3 months after production. If it's a product design issue, then it will tend to fail after a few uses, or after repeated use, maybe after 3 months, 6 months, 9 months, 12 months, right? If that's where the bulk of the failures take place, then it's more of a product design issue. And that leads me to my second point, it might be poor manufacturing. Okay, so just a simple example, electronic products, very often there's some manual soldering. Okay, you have the PCBA, and then there's a few wires need to be connected to the battery and to this and that element. Okay, and manual soldering, if it's not done with great care and in a very systematic manner, will not be done consistently well. And then, the product might be okay if you test it right after, might be okay if you test it after shipment. Then the user drops the product from, even if it's just 20, 30 centimeter, and then suddenly it doesn't work anymore. Well, the soldering broke and there's no more contact. Very, very common source of failure. So this is a reliability issue that comes from poor manufacturing. Okay, and there's a lot of examples of that. If you have good process control, this will help you have better product reliability. Okay.
Mm.
Yeah. So one of the things to look at is what about the supplier's own manufacturing process? Sort of, do they know what they're doing? Can they do it in a consistent manner, consistently well? Yes or no, right?
Mm.
And yeah, in some cases, go to a place and we're like, well, this is a workshop. It's not really a manufacturing place, right? There's no supplier quality management. There's no regular quality control, checkpoints that are applied consistently. Maybe there's no maintenance of the production equipment. There's no, so basically they're just putting stuff together and shipping it out, but without any kind of assurance, right? So everything is possible in that case. That's the worst, of course. That's the worst case. And I'm kind of drawing a caricature here. But yeah, in some cases, that's that. If your supplier is, 10, 20, 30 people, that's actually quite likely. Okay. They just put things together for other companies, and the other companies select the components, buy the components, check the components, send the components to them, and then send their own inspectors to check on production and finished product. But then suddenly they get a direct customer, is you, they're happy, and they have someone to kind of translate, and but they don't have any idea about how to make it all work, right? So their fault or your fault? Well, yeah, their fault because they should know, but also your fault because you picked the wrong supplier for your needs, right? So that's a very common situation. And then sometimes, and that's really sort of infuriating to a lot of buyers, the recurring quality issues come from the suppliers of the supplier, the sub-suppliers, or sub-suppliers, right? Or it comes from whatever. It comes from, it's the plating. The plating is bad. Oh, okay. Well, let's go have a look. Well, you can't, because, maybe they buy that part that's die cast in their supplier, and their supplier has their own surface treatment supplier who does the plating, and your supplier doesn't even know where the plating is done. Very common, right? So how do you even start to fix that, right? And your supplier, anyway, has zero understanding of the plating process, right? Is it because of the geometry of the part and the way they placed it in the parts like this, and maybe they should be? No, they have no clue about that. What amount of solid is in the bath, and how often do they check it? And no, they have no clue, right? And how come, or maybe this comes from some grease or from some dirt and was not properly prepared. They have no clue. Your supplier cannot help you. And even if you know exactly what they're supposed to do in the plating area, you are not allowed to go, because even your supplier is not allowed to go, because even your supplier doesn't know where it is. And in that case, the die casting supplier treats it as a business secret, right? Very common in China, right? And maybe even if you push hard and you get access, maybe they will say, well, you can go, but you cannot go to that specific room where we actually do the plating. That's real story. And then you're like, okay, then, why come at all? It's just a waste of time. And maybe it's also a way for them to cover their tracks and say, well, I bring them to my friend's plating factory or whatever. And at the same time, I tell these guys, just tell them you have your production. Next time we put the production in your place, but it's not even the place where plating is taking place, right? It's just, welcome to China, basically. If you haven't done your work of setting up the supply chain properly, and you work with the wrong kind of supplier, that's very likely to happen. Very, very likely. So it's a supplier's issue, a sub-supplier's issue, what do you do with your supplier? Well, you should be rejecting parts if they're bad, right? How have they accepted it? And this is, again, one of these things that infuriates the typical foreign buyer is they will say, well, oh, it's the supplier's problem. It's the supplier's problem. Well, okay, but, your supplier is accountable to you and you're accountable to me, right? Oh, well, it's not really us, it's the supplier. And, it's very complicated and, whatever. Oh, plating, most of the small plating factories were closed because they did not have the way to treat the water properly and they could not comply with the law. Now it's only big places and they're not interested in your small orders. It's very, very hard. Nobody really wants to accept your orders. This is sort of the best you can get, get used to it, right? That's the message between the lines. And then what do you do? Well, in some cases, it's better to start fresh and try to set up discipline in the right way. And some of the times it's better to work with the current supplier and maybe they can change their own supplier. And maybe you need to help them and push them, help them even to find, a better supplier, right? Many buyers had to do that. So it really comes down to a root cause analysis, okay? And next, what will you do better? Will you be better at selecting your supplier and your entire supply chain? Will you be better at actually documenting the type of standard that you want them to follow? How can you even confirm that standard is a good fit for that supplier next time? Maybe trying to gauge what kind of other customers they tend to work with and things like that, right? A lot of questions, a lot of open questions here, because it depends so much on the exact specific situation. But these are the right questions generally that buyers need to ask.
Okay.
I hope that makes sense.
It certainly does. It certainly does. And I mean, talking about the quality standard, it all starts from there. And that's actually, that's sort of homework, isn't it? That's homework for you yourself, the buyer. And we have spoken about quality standards before on the podcast. I will add at this point, because we didn't mention that at the start, but do look out for the show notes, because I'll leave links to our podcast episodes on quality standards. And also some of the amazing content that you've written about the AQL as well. I think that's something to include, and switching manufacturers. There'll be all sorts of stuff in there. A good one today, Renaud. Thanks. I think that's very, very helpful to the listeners, I hope.
Great. Yeah. Thanks, Adrian. All right. Well, then thanks to the listeners, and stay tuned for the next episode next week.
Thanks again for listening to this podcast, brought to you by the Sofeast Group. We're on a mission to provide you with everything you need to manufacture effectively in Asia, including inspections, auditing, new product development support, contract manufacturing, 3PL warehousing and fulfillment, and much, much more across Asia's key manufacturing areas. Visit us at sofeast.com, that's SOFEAST.com, to learn more and get help. If you've enjoyed the podcast today, please do rate, review and share, because it will really help others discover us too.